Good morning and welcome back to Election 26. My name is Coll McCail, I edit Skotia, and it is 8 minutes past 10 on the morning of Saturday, the 9th of May. The Scottish election results are in, and I'm joined by Rory Hamilton and Samuel Rafanell-Williams to talk about them. Rory, how are you doing? Did you stay up for the Highlands and Islands count?
I did, regrettably, and feeling the worse for the wear. Worse for the wear? The worse. I'm feeling whatever after after watching it come in.
Sam, how you doing?
I'm okay. Yeah, I did not stay up. I stayed up pretty late, but there was a moment where there was some discussion on the internet about whether it was going to be hours or whether it was going to be 20 more minutes, and it was already past midnight at that stage, so I just decided to call it.
A wise move. As I was saying to you before I came on air, I was long in my bed by the time the results came in, partly because when I tuned into the Highlands and Islands Council live stream, I could see literally 3 people counting votes. But I suppose if you will cut local government budgets for the course of a decade, these are the sorts of things which one must contend with. We have one hell of
That's
a lot
probably a
to
record
talk about.
time for you mentioning local austerity call.
I would say so. We have one hell of a lot to talk about this morning. The big picture is this. The SNP have been returned to Holyrood as Scotland's largest party, winning 58 seats, an incredible result for a party which has been incumbent for 19 years, but nonetheless, the SNP did lose 6 seats. Reform and Labour tied for second, both winning 17. That for the Labour Party constitutes a loss of 4 seats. Reform, the new kids on the block, as we've heard so often, winning 17 seats newly. Greens in fourth with 15 seats. That's a win of 6 seats for them. The Lib Dems coming in with 12 seats and the Tories behind them with 10. Worth saying, I think, that there has never been a Scottish Parliament in which more than 4 parties have had double digits in terms of seats. In this Parliament, there are going to be 6 parties with double digits in terms of seats. So the electoral arithmetic here is really going to be quite interesting, but that is a minor talking point in what was a bumper election day. And as I said, we have a hell of a lot to get through before we begin. If you've enjoyed Scotia's election coverage, please do support us financially on Patreon. It's the only way we're able to deliver coverage like this. We also have a mailing list and a WhatsApp channel. The links to both of those will be in the show notes, so please make time to sign up for both when you can. I think the best way to organize this podcast is going to be to take the parties in turn and make additional comments where relevant. So let's begin, I think, by talking about the SNP, who, regardless of the fact that they lost seats, undoubtedly had an impressive night. This was a party which, over the last few years, has endured all kinds of scandal, which would typically have written them off as a contender, let alone outright winner. Rory, let's come to you first. What did you make of the SNP's night?
Well, I think it could have got off to a worse. It could have got off to worse starts in the sense that they picked up a seat in Shetland, which I think was a bit of a surprise. I think most people would have said that it's a sort of Lib Dem stronghold, especially coming after Liam MacArthur, taking 70% in Orkney. Was it? What does it? The overall picture looked like for the SNP? They got 38% on the constituency and 27% on the region, which is a sort of a general swing of 9% down and 13% down. So clearly, voters are tired of the SNP. They want to send a message of some sort, but I think the fact that the SNP sort of swept the constituency seats, I think it's quite sad in a way. Like they almost don't have to blink just to pick up a really substantial amount in Parliament. I think what will be interesting is what the agenda that comes out of this is, how the lack of a majority shapes Joe Swinney's program for government, how they interact with the other parties, and I think this is where keeping up with the discourse and watching, what commentators are saying on the BBC coverage yesterday, is worth commenting on. Liz Lloyd's former advisor to Nicola Sturgeon, or chief of staff to Nicola Sturgeon, sorry, was talking about John Swinney being far more pro-business and also perhaps looking to strike deals where possible with the Lib Dems, which he's already done. I think it's interesting that would be the gut reaction to go to, right? I don't think that it's politically expedient necessarily for the Greens to look to make formal cooperation agreements with the SNP this time, given that they're kind of winning off the back of poor SNP performance. So I could see how John Swinney would feel that they're not his natural allies this time around, and I think given the sort of the competition from the Lib Dems, it's the middle class voters that the SNP have lost in that direction. But the SNP did also lose 28% of their previous list support to the Greens. There's a clear left pool. Now, whether the Greens are left enough for this podcast, that's another matter. But they're certainly to the left of the SNP government, I would say. So for sort of senior figures within the SNP circles like Liz Lloyd to be suggesting that is not going to be an influencing factor, I think is concerning to start with. And I really think that we need to think about how best to utilize those new voices that can put pressure on the SNP to push further leftwards, given sort of, there's a local election in 12 months' time. Sorry to bring it up instantly.
Yes, very, very important point. Sam, I'll bring you in, but first it's worth noting that the SNP vote did drop on the constituency by roughly 10%. The only places, in fact, where there was no drop in SNP support were in Glasgow, Cathcart and Pollock, as well as Shetland, as Rory mentions, where Hannah Mary Goodlad won. Hannah Mary Goodlad is an interesting candidate, right? A background in renewable energy, a background in particular working for Equinor. So how that experience and that corporate backdrop fits within the new parliament is worth noting. On oil and gas, there were other interesting admissions throughout the course of the victory speeches. Stephen Flynn, winning his seat in Aberdeen, was quick to reaffirm his support for the oil and gas industry, who he said would have no greater champion in Parliament. Worth noting again as well, the turnout was down across the board other than in a couple of seats, one of which was Glasgow Kelvin. Sam, what did you make of the SNP's night?
So yeah, I think Rory's assessment there was very nuanced and very interesting. My take is that there was an overall degree of underperformance from the SNP on balance, but that they won't necessarily be unhappy, and actually, not having that majority is not necessarily of disadvantage for particular reasons I'll go into. But just in terms of the balance of performance, yeah, Rory's right. They won that Shetland constituency, and they managed to hold off Reform in their kind of key target constituency seats, which I think is very notable, by the way. This we'll get onto Reform later on, but the fact that they didn't win those constituency seats, and especially that Banffshire one, where the SNP held on by a hair's breadth, 300 votes, I think, is very notable. But of course, they lost the Western Islands by less than 200 votes, and those big wins by the Greens in Edinburgh Central and Glasgow South are something that the SNP will be worried about, because those were very convincing. And in other kind of statistics, this was quite late on to the night, and I'm not sure if this panned out exactly the way that John Curtis said so, but he said that they were on, was it 37% vote share? He said that was the lowest SNP share of the vote since 2003. I'm not sure if you you guys have a corrective to that. But that's what Professor John Curtis was saying late last night. John Swinney was First Minister back in 2003. But if that's true, then that's another indication of just how much their support is sagging, the SNP support is sagging in this election compared to, their previous performances in recent times. But my view basically overall is that there was a degree of underperformance there, and their outcome in terms of seats was on the lower end of the projections. I mean, John Curtis was saying until very late last night that they would get 61, 62, or 63 seats. That did not transpire, which I think is very interesting. But my view is that the leadership won't necessarily be that displeased with this. It means, I think, that they won't have to pursue independence very aggressively as part of their agenda. It won't be, they won't have that albatross around their neck, which is how I believe they view independence, by the way. But then there's all these other elements about the domestic agenda that Rory went into, and how they're going to try and pass legislation, where they're going to try and draw support, which are very interesting. Very difficult to speculate on what's going to happen now. And there's a particular point of view from which the SNP actually have options in terms of pulling support from the Lib Dems and pulling support from the Greens. So, I mean, that's what we really have to look out for, as Rory has already explained, and that's going to be very interesting.
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of really, really good points in there that I want to tease out. First, I think, Sam, that the result last night on the constituency ballot was the SNP's lowest share of the vote since 2007 rather than since 2003. But I'm willing to be corrected again, and I fumbled the turnout statistic a moment ago, so I'll just repeat that. The SNP's vote was down in every constituency except Shetland and Glasgow Central, and turnout was down in every seat but Glasgow Kelvin. A couple of points based on what Sam just said. I think there is a broader picture at play here to highlight the fact that I think the Greens constituency wins in Edinburgh and the south side of Glasgow constitute the first time that an independent supporting party has won a constituency seat that's not the SNP since 2003. No, actually, the SSP didn't win any constituency seats in 2003. So I think that possibly that's the first time a pro-independent supporting party that's not the SNP has won a constituency seat since 1999. If that even happened in 1999, one to come back to, I think. But that's a very interesting development, right? That possibly this is the first time that we are seeing nationalist voices exist in the constituency, as well as on the list, and that does threaten the SNP, whose dominance of that first ballot has been pretty consistent for a very, very long time now. So that's the sort of threat to the SNP's left, if you like. And I think, again, we should emphasize, for a party that's been incumbent for 19 years, this is an incredible result, right? To win another 5 years, a third decade in government with John Swinney at the helm, with all the scandals that have gone, is incredible. What we are highlighting is that if you look beneath the bonnet, there are some complexities, and those complexities are as follows. The first is a threat on your left flank, and now in constituencies from the Greens, who are winning across Scotland. Rossby are right to point out that the Greens are now a national party. And I think that constituency statistic, if we have it right, and it is the first time a pro-indie party have won a constituency that's not the SNP since 1999, is very important, especially because there have been these conversations about the extent to which Scottish nationalism can survive out with the SNP. We've seen the collapse of Alba, we've seen the failure of other outfits, but perhaps the avenue is through the Greens, who admittedly didn't foreground independence in their campaign, but nonetheless do support constitutional change. So there's that threat from the left. The other great beneficiary to the SNP in this election was the split in the Unionist vote, right? Which I think we talk about a lot as a bloc, and there are a whole lot of diversities within that unionist vote that it would be wrong not to highlight, but nonetheless, the SNP were allowed to win seats with about 32-33% of the constituency vote yesterday. Now, that's an incredibly low number of seats to win constituencies on, and it happens because you have this split between Reform, the Lib Dems, the Tories, and Labour, right? And what they have done is kneecapped one another to prevent a unionist MSP being elected, and that again is quite something, and testament again to the extent to which the drop in support for the SNP can be disguised by reform. I think one of the best tweets I saw yesterday, and there were many, perhaps we should have a dedicated podcast segment to this in future, was that John Swinney really does owe Nigel Farage a pint, because without that reform component in the election, results might look slightly different. Is there anything else to say on the SNP, or shall we move on?
Yeah, Coll, I just want to quickly, before we move on, consider the changing makeup of the MSP cohort, and in particular the SNP MSP cohort, because we've talked about quite a lot of the sort of drain of talent, I guess, out of the parliament. A lot of 99ers left. In fact, the only two 99ers that left, or at least who had constituency seats, are Jackie Bailey from Dumbarton and John Swinney up in Perth. But I think we have to think about, there's a lot of former MPs who lost their seats in Westminster 2 years ago who are now moving up, Kirsten Oswald being one. And Stephen Flynn, another MP coming up, Stephen Gethins, and at the same time, the likes of Kate Forbes, Deputy First Minister, Shona Robeson, Finance Secretary. These are big sort of cabinet positions that are being lost, and so thinking about who's going to fill those, I think some of these new MSPs will have to probably jump straight into cabinet portfolios, and I think it'll be interesting to see who gets promoted from previous ministerial positions. I'd like to note that there are a few SNP MSPs who might have actually done some good work. Tom Arthur, I think, in particular, his work on the community wealth building bills to be commended, and it would be great to see him elevated to a cabinet position, I'd say, and I think that would certainly do something in regards to keeping the SNP's economic position slightly further left than it would otherwise be under a sort of Kate Forbes regime. Nevertheless, what's the parliament going to look like in terms of lots of new MSPs getting to grasp with things, like lots of experiences been lost from the parliament. There's been talk about how much that's going to freshen up the politics, but also there's so many of the people that have come into parliament are, as we've talked about before, staffers of various sorts. So to what extent is that gonna, I don't know, calcify the sort of the rot at the centre of Holyrood's ability to effectively and competently make policy? I think these are key questions that we need to think about in terms of the new MSPs coming in.
Yeah, there was a moment in the BBC's election coverage where Douglas Ross highlighted the number of former MSP staff who had been elevated to Parliament. I think that you're right, Rory, and what you said reminded me that we haven't touched on Angus Robertson's defeat in Edinburgh Central, right? I mean, again, talk about funny moments from yesterday. The sight of Angus Robertson losing his seat next to a very large Gannet was quite funny. But again, an SNP big beast, and somebody who within the party has been pretty influential in driving its direction over the last 15 years. Angus Robertson, of course, was there in 2012, and I think moved the motion that saw the SNP abandon its opposition to NATO membership in the event of independence some 13, 14 years ago now, and of course came a cropper recently because of his meeting with the deputy Israeli ambassador. So I think that is an interesting loss, right? And what it says broadly about the direction of Scottish politics, that a figure like Robertson, who is very much in the forefront of the neoliberalisation of the SNP, should lose his seat to the Greens. probably lots to dwell on in that, and something we should reflect on more over the coming weeks. But let's move on, because I want to keep this podcast as short as possible, conscious though that we have a lot to get through. I think we'll talk about Reform next, who with 17 seats tied with Labour may well form the second largest party in Holyrood. Who gets that second spot at First Minister's Questions, I suppose they'll have to work out. They saw wins in no constituencies, but picked up on the list, I think 3 in the south of Scotland, 2 in the Highlands and Islands. Thomas Kerr elected in Glasgow beside his colleague Malcolm Offord, though coming third in his constituency battle, was elected on the West of Scotland list. How have we thought the Reform? How do we think Reform got on, Rory?
Well, I think the turnout, I think, helped them, as is generally the case across Europe in terms of lower turnout helps the far right, and in this case, the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish election was a 53% turnout, which is significantly down on last time, and there's lots of discussion around like COVID and the prominence of the Parliament last time. I'm not sure how much that's the case. I think people, I mean, they also love to talk in the campaign this year about the scunneredness of the electorate, and to like, I love a good Scots phrase, but to the extent that it was used, it was a bit Scots cringe after a while. But I do think voters are feeling disaffected with the general politics that are going on, and caused a lot of them to stay home. Professor Ailsa Henderson's analysis indicated that Reform took half of their votes from Tories, which I think is indicative of the fact that probably half of their candidates are ex-Tories, or a significant proportion have been ex-Tories, right? Why would you buy the light version when you can get the authentic version? And it's right there. I think it's clear that the sort of left and right blocks, if we discard independence and unionism for a second, are pushing towards their polls rather than Labour voters peeling off towards Reform. I think only 11% came from Labour, and 15% came from those that didn't vote, and interestingly 12% from previous SNP supporters. I think just before I'm keen to hear your thoughts, but I think just before I pass on, that the fact that the likes of Malcolm Offord were fairly well beaten in constituencies indicates that I think Reform haven't got much further room to go in terms of gaining, and I think voters are wise to the individuals, and I think the list has benefited them quite a lot in this regard. But I do think that they're forced to be aware of like they're going to be putting members' bills forward, and I reckon there's going to be some batshit stuff that comes out. But I'm keen to hear what you guys think, especially around where Reform are pulling those votes, especially that sort of 12% from the SNP.
Sam, what have you made of Reform's performance?
Yeah, very interesting analysis, Rory. And there's this debate about Reform in terms of whether they are simply there to replace the Tory party, or whether they are mobilizing or forming a kind of much broader coalition, of voters in a kind of cross-class sense. Those figures that you gave us kind of gave some indication of that, in terms of like pulling half of their votes from former Tory supporters and kind of sprinkles from other groups. Basically it paints a mixed picture. In terms of their performance, you point out that obviously we have already pointed out that they lost their kind of target constituency seats, although that Banffshire seat, as I've mentioned already, was a hair's breadth away. They'll feel confident contesting that in future. Offord and Kerr lost their constituency races pretty embarrassingly. So that is interesting. And, it's hard to tell what their strategy will be on the constituency side of future elections. But having said all this, they were square in the middle of their projections for what they would get. Early on in the night, their losses in the constituency races were leading some commentators to say, "Oh, maybe their list vote will be weaker than has assumed." Didn't turn out to be, because Reform UK Scotland themselves were saying very early on in the campaign, we're going to get between 50 and 20, and along with what the polling was also predicting, and that turns out to have been the case. And to be contesting the opposition in Holyrood is a very strong showing. And also, I don't think it makes much of a difference to them whether they will form the opposition. I think they're going to cause a ruckus in the parliament, one way or another, and that's their main objective. And in terms of the ceiling, Rory, I think it's a good question. I do think the Reform has a ceiling. I think that all parties currently have a ceiling, especially with this immense fracturing of the vote that we're seeing. But the question is, how well will they operate within Holyrood? How well will they learn its system as a way of, grabbing the rungs of the ladder and pulling themselves further up? I suspect that they'll operate quite well in there, even on the peripheries, and they'll raise their profile, and they'll shift the conversation nationally. So, ultimately, I think Reform will be very happy with how it went in Scotland, despite these constituency losses. It's a stepping stone game for them, especially in Scotland. They're there to kind of raise the profile of the party in advance of a general election. I think that's the overall strategy.
Yeah, I think you're right to highlight the sort of dichotomy in Reform support and direction. I think the campaign they ran was interesting in the sense that Malcolm Offord's presence sort of served to dilute the more populist elements of Reform's campaign. He was an old Tory Don who had immense wealth, who wasn't particularly comfortable, I didn't think, and looked sort of a bit squeamish around the more overtly populist side of Reform's campaign, which was much more comfortably carried by a figure like Thomas Kerr. I think with the Reform result, there's an element and an extent to which cooler heads have to prevail. I think, this being the first time that a party to the right of the Tories have entered Holyrood will spark a reaction. But I think that understanding Reform's support is important, and being mindful of who constitutes Reform's new MSPs is important. Although saying that, the sort of pronouncements in the latter days of the campaign from Thomas Kerr around promising to put a immigration detention centre in Pollock Shields if it dared to vote Green were disgusting. So I think Reform remain to an extent an unknown quantity regarding how they'll behave in Holyrood. There was a funny moment in the BBC's coverage again where Paul Sinclair described them as the SSP on acid regarding how they would behave in Holyrood. And I think to an extent there's an element of truth in that, right? In the sense that the SSP went in there as dedicated disruptors. I think that from our point of view, we have to hope that Reform don't go in there as dedicated disruptors, because if they do, they might be quite effective. And there are, as we well know, and as we talk about often, elements of politics in Scotland which they would be very well placed to rip the piss out of. And yeah, we shall see. It's worth noting that in seats in Glasgow, they beat Labour into third place, which again is quite something regarding the history of Glasgow as a Labour city, and of course tying with Labour in a country where once their ballots were weighed rather than counted, really is a testament, I think, more to Labour's decline than Reform's success. But again, it's worth emphasising that this result didn't feel, perhaps because of the way Malcolm Offord carried himself in a lot of the interviews he gave yesterday, where he was sort of bored, looked quite disappointed, at one point looked a bit pissed. I wonder if he's quite disappointed, right? Him as an individual who can go yachting in the Channel when he wants. Is he that interested in coming third in a Scottish Parliament election and hanging around for 5 years, talking about greyhound racing and dog theft? I'm not so sure. Which is not to say the greyhound racing bill and dog theft Scotland bill weren't important, but you get the picture. Malcolm Offord's interested apparently in big politics or whatever. But I think that will be an interesting question if he can marshal Reform's ranks to remain interested for 4 or 5 years, pulling as they do on such a diverse range of candidates. That said, I think the element of insurgency that might have characterised Reform's campaign wasn't there to the extent that it might have been yesterday. I don't think it felt like a historic moment, right? In the way that it might have done. And I think that partly is because we grew used to the prospect of these people being elected. Sam, do you wanna come in on that?
Very simply to say, especially when you compare it to the results of both in England and Wales, that's which we saw last night. We've not even touched on it yet, but in comparison, I completely agree with you.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying that we probably won't touch on the historic developments, particularly in Wales, during this podcast. We might at a later date, but let's stick with Scotland for now, because as I say, we still have a lot to get through. But you are absolutely right. Let's talk about Scottish Labour. We've talked a lot about Scottish Labour on the podcast. Anas Sarwar, despite what he was telling us 48 hours ago, is not the First Minister of Scotland. In fact, he's he may well be the leader of the second largest party. We shall see how people sit in Holyrood, but he has finished joint second. He conceded defeat yesterday after just 7 seats were declared, which begs the question, why insist that you were going to become First Minister right up until polling day if you were going to give up after Orkney had been given to the Lib Dems? Lots to say, I think, on Scottish Labour. Rory, what have you made of their performance?
I mean, it's a tricky one, because I don't think it's a terrible result for Labour, given that some of the polls were indicating they could come up with 12 seats. This is at the higher end of estimates. I think in the context of where Scottish Labour were perhaps a year or two ago in the polls and where they've been historically, obviously it's extremely disappointing. But I think the fact that it's not as bad as perhaps predicted raises some questions around Scottish Labour leadership, mostly. Obviously, it's a smaller cohort than last time. I think where the parliamentary Labour Party in Scotland goes now is crucial as to how they fare next time. That's the thing. I think it looks like Anas Sarwar doesn't want to be there anymore. But you're right to say, Coll, that why would you pitch yourself as First Minister if you knew you were going to concede after so early, right? I think there's 2 things that I would ask of the pair of you. Firstly, actually, one thing I'd ask, and the other is more of a comment, to be honest. It's good that there's a couple of socialist MSPs within the Labour Party who've managed to get in. Katie Clark being one, Carol Mochan, also backed by the Campaign for Socialism, and I believe Paul Sweeney as well, also backed by the Campaign for Socialism. There's a few Labour MSPs on the left that either weren't standing or didn't get in. Monica Lennon, notably, didn't win her seat on the list in Glasgow. So I think, the 2 questions that arise for me. One is, to what extent would Keir Starmer resigning in advance of the election have changed Anas Sarwar's fortunes, and what does that mean for any potential Labour leadership elections after the election now in Scotland? And what role can the Scottish Labour left play in shaping the Scottish Labour Party now, given one, how small the Scottish Labour cohort is, and two, how small the Scottish Labour left cohort is, right? I think these are the two key questions that come out of this for me.
Sam, what do you make of those questions and Labour's performance?
Well, in terms of the performance, I do broadly agree with Rory. It's to me, it seemed not as bad as was expected and predicted by some polling, and again, especially compared to UK Labour's performance in Wales and in the council elections in England. The losses are there were losses, right? And I think I'm right in saying that Scottish Labour has never gained seats in a Scottish parliamentary election, and this continues that trend. So it is a secular decline of Scottish Labour in Scotland, it seems. But the losses were not as dramatic as they were elsewhere in the country. I mean, the Wales Labour, the Welsh Labour result was just like absolutely catastrophic. So that's how I feel in terms of the performance. Their performance was moderate. And to answer your question, very interesting questions, Rory. I personally think that Anas Sarwar gained the political capital that he could have already just from coming out and calling for Starmer's resignation. And I'm not sure if an actual resignation would have helped him much more. That's my view. I mean, I think there's also a view that it hurt him that he didn't resign, and it made him look like a bit of a fool. But I'm not so sure about that, because just coming out and saying I disagree with this guy's premiership, I feel like would resonate with more people, with more voters, even if it doesn't, puts him in bad standing with Labour MPs, right? And I think that is going to be the issue going forward, is the relationship of Anas Sarwar with the UK Labour Party and the Scottish Labour MPs who came out last night very, very, very scathing, actually. Were briefing in very scathing terms about the Scottish Labour election. I would note that there's going to be that friction there to account for. And in terms of the left Labour cohort and the prospects for shifting Scottish Labour leftwards, I find that very hard to predict. I think it depends. I think it depends a lot on how disposed members are and individuals are to join the Scottish Labour Party and mobilise to, operate, to work within its machinery to shift it leftwards. And I don't see there being very good prospects for that. It doesn't seem like a very appealing proposition for socialists in Scotland currently. I think it's perhaps less to do with the leadership and more to do with whether they can kind of recapture some grassroots momentum, and I don't see that happening. But very interesting questions, Rory.
So I'm going to disagree with you both a bit. I think this is a cataclysmically bad result for Labour, and I don't think we should really allow the Welsh or the English result to distract from that, although it might not be as bad, right? I mean, Labour were beaten into third on the list ballot by Reform, albeit narrowly. As I said earlier, beaten into third in seats in Glasgow by Reform, in Carrick, Cumnock and Doon Valley, a seat with such historic significance for the party because of its association with Keir Hardie. Again, Reform outperforming them. So I think this is a very, very bad result after a very, very bad campaign, a transparently bad campaign. We talked about it right through, the weaknesses in trying to make Anas Sarwar a presidential candidate despite his very low approval ratings among the public, right? So I think that there was a lot of expectation around Scottish Labour, right? There was this notion that they had outperformed the polls in the past, that at both the Rutherglen by-election and the Hamilton Lark College Stonehouse by-election, they had been the underdog but outperformed expectation. There was a lot of talk about how great their data was, about how great their ground game was as a result of all of this money that's sloshing about the party from private donors like the Easdale brothers. And yet here we are with a result that sees the party finish joint second, well short of the SNP, conceding, as I say, after just 7 seats. This is a party that wanted to lead the country, conceding before we get to the list declarations, before we get even to over 10% of constituency seats declared, right? So I do think that this is pathetically bad for the Labour Party in Scotland. I think there are interesting developments elsewhere, right? I think like winning the Western Isles is an interesting example of where you can pick a candidate who's good and local and who can hammer home an issue. Donald McKinnon, very active in the ferries campaigning in the Western Isles, an issue which has plagued the people of Scotland's islands for decades, and he wins, right? So there are good examples there of what a much better campaign might have looked like from Scottish Labour, but instead they chose to put Anna Sarwar on as many election leaflets as possible, and it backfired woefully for them. Another nominee for the best tweet I saw yesterday was regarding Jackie Baillie retaining Dumbarton, somebody pointing out that Jackie Baillie could shoot somebody in the centre of Dumbarton and still hold the seat, and I think that that's probably quite entertaining, but impressive nonetheless that, as Roy points out, she should remain one of the 2 remaining 99ers in a party which, as we acknowledge, has lost seats at every Holyrood election since Parliament convened. So a pretty abysmal result for Labour, I would say, and yes, not as bad as elsewhere, but in the context of running a campaign for First Minister, this is very, very poor. And the point, I think, to Rory's question is who would want Anna Sarwar's job at the moment, right? Like, who would want to come forward and take up that mantle? And I think what you see in Anas's communications following his defeat is that he's going to stay on and try and hold the party together. Jackie Baillie backed him to do that yesterday. And that's not particularly surprising, but it is the case that with a smaller MSP group, and as you mentioned, some very good political heavyweights not making it back into Parliament, such as Monica Lennon, it's feasible that Anna Sarwar makes his way around the MSP group and says, well, we need to rally together now and it's not time for a change in leadership. And in that eventuality, I think the prospects for the party can only continue to diminish. So yes, I don't know if there's that much to say on Scottish Labour, partly because this was predictably bad, right? And the only people who didn't seem to believe it were Scottish Labour staffers and politicians. But we are where we are. Another excellent quote yesterday from a Scottish Labour source, I think, to the Daily Record, was that Anna Sarwar was like the person trying to carry 4 pints from the bar back to his table. Everybody knows that he's going to drop one of them, but he thinks that he can do it and make it over. So yeah, a bad night for the Scottish Labour Party, and the latest in a series of bad nights at Holyrood. Liz Lloyd, and I'll credit her with making a good point in the election coverage, said that in Scotland, in our historical memory and in our imaginary, Labour occupy a much larger place than they should. So we talk about Labour voters, we talk about the Labour Party as an institution. I think this result, perhaps more than any other that we've seen, displays the extent to which that's not really true anymore, right? There aren't necessarily a core Labour base, or isn't necessarily a core Labour base anymore. That has diminished drastically over the last 10 years. Let's move on to the Scottish Greens, who had a historic night, gaining their first constituency seats in Edinburgh Central from Angus Robertson, and in Glasgow South Side, where Holly Bruce beat SNP Cabinet Minister Co-Cab Stewart in Nicola Sturgeon's former seat. The Greens picked up 13 other seats on the list ballot, by far their best performance ever in Scotland. Rory, what did you make of the Greens night?
far be it from me to diminish the gains made by the Greens, but actually I think I'd be quite disappointed with this, despite the gains that the Greens have made. I mean, so like given the polls were predicting there was a potential range in which they could be approaching 20 MSPs, right? I think I think given the how close they were predicted perhaps to pick up a couple of additional constituency seats, and how much they got the vote out in those seats, I think they'd be disappointed that they didn't get at least one more constituency to start with, perhaps the other Glasgow constituency that they were targeting. It is a good result. I shouldn't diminish that. It is good for the Greens. I think their ability to mobilise the vote. I think they drew something like 24% of their support from people who had previously not voted or didn't vote at the previous election. Sorry, and that there's something to be said for that around some sort of optimistic vision for Scotland, which can mobilise people who are a bit disenfranchised. I think they should take some joy from that. And do you know what I think is particularly impressive, particularly strong, is taking 3 list seats in Edinburgh. I mean, Edinburgh has been a fairly small C conservative city for a while, centre of business, etc. I guess we shouldn't be too surprised that they'd be picking up at least 2 there, given sort of student vote, etc. However, to get 3 and win in a constituency, I think shows that there's a real strong base building there, and that's something that the Greens should regroup, think about, and capture. What that's going to be going forward for them. I think I'll leave you guys to unpack the actual how it played out in the vote. But one thing I would like to pick up on, it was on the BBC's coverage, talking about like the SSP once they got into Parliament being like herding cats or something like that. And I can't remember who it was on the BBC giving analysis saying that the Greens might end up like that in Parliament. I don't know where that's coming from. I think it predisposes some of the biases of some of the people that ended up on the BBC in the coverage. I think it will be interesting to see what role can a larger Green cohort play, given some of the criticisms we've laid at their feet before around local government austerity, around privatization deals in the nature and energy sectors. I think, can that group forge a really strong ideological identity? Because I think there was something that was talked about in this campaign was the lack of the emphasis on the climate. I think it was an attempt to talk to broader issues, and given the nature of the conversation around energy and just just transition in the North Sea, I think they have a really good base from which to make a good case on renewables, to make a good case for sort of public ownership of energy and things like that. But they need to coordinate. I think whipping that group will be interesting. I'm not sure it will be quite the herding cats, but it's a big step up for a lot of these people who I think before might have just primarily been community-based activists. And what that means in terms of actually passing legislation, drafting competent legislation, in the same way that it what it'll mean for the new Reform MSPs who were previously just business people, etc. Yada yada yada. Like, there's a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge to be gained very quickly, and I think it's important for us on the left to think about our ability to influence people who are probably more slightly disposed to our positions, and getting in there before sort of green capitalist interests do. What do you guys make of the results? Sam, perhaps.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I take your points, Rory, and I think there was a moment last night where I did think they were the Greens were gonna get closer to that higher end of the predictions. They didn't. But I think on balance, they should be pleased. I mean, listen, the notion that they're very close to leveling their presence in the Parliament with Scottish Labour and Reform is really, really notable. It shows that in terms of what Coll was talking about the Scottish Labour base, the Greens are kind of forming their own sort of base in Scotland, which is in and around the cities, obviously. And I think that what they're doing is, as it is the case elsewhere in the UK, they're capturing this kind of growing body of downwardly mobile graduates in places like Glasgow and Edinburgh, as well as capturing disaffected SNP voters. So they are forming their own base, and they're creating a platform from which I think they could probably grow further, although I think that a lot of that depends on their performance in the next parliament along the lines that you've already laid out. I think the constituency results, they were very close, by the way, to winning West Glasgow. Was it Kelvin and Mary Hill? It was only 1,000 votes or maybe less. And the margins in Glasgow South and Central show, I think, that their efforts in organising and their efforts in media as well, social media, are bearing fruit. So, I think I take your points, but on balance, this is a good result. And Coll, did you have a question about there's a question, I think, about the green ceiling?
Yeah, I think I want to make a couple of points, and we'll come back to this question about the green ceiling and whether it exists or not. I think this is like a phenomenal result for the Greens, to be honest. Like I'll disagree with you both. I think it's an understatement to say it's good, right? Like, I mean, they almost beat the SNP outright on the Glasgow list vote, right? And that's a pretty and in Edinburgh, right? Like, that's pretty impressive for a party that has less than 10,000 members, maybe just more than 10,000 members now, following the Polanski bounce. And that's the context in which this happens, right? They did very well out of a green wave, which is taking place across Britain. A couple of points to make, right? Like, they come second in Aberdeen Central on the list vote, for example, the historic heartlands of oil and gas. And again, I think that speaks to what Sam says about Aberdeen being a university city as well. But also, like, we don't quite know who Green voters are at this stage. Their success and the fact that they are now a national party with representation across every region for the first time suggests that who we think of as Green voters might need to change. We'll discuss that. We'll find out in data that comes out in the coming weeks and months, no doubt, but it's certainly worth thinking through. They beat Reform in Glasgow by 20,000 votes, beat Labour in Glasgow on the list by 10,000 votes. So some pretty impressive results for the Greens. I think the comment about herding cats is actually interesting. It's something I've thought about, right? Is we have seen a factional divide in the Greens before. We've seen many Green activists, almost the entirety of the Glasgow branch, leave the party to join the fledgling Your Party in recent months. And in some ways that kind of makes this achievement all the more impressive. And I say this as a critic of the Green Party, right? To lose so much of your local infrastructure in November, maybe earlier than that, maybe it was August last summer, and then be able to win that many votes on the second ballot is quite impressive. So yeah, I think a very, very good result. But I do think that there is this question about how Ross Greer and Gillian Mackay will be able to marshal the group, because it is going to be more unwieldy in the same way that having more SSP MPs than just Tommy Sheridan made it harder for the SSP to marshal its group compared to 1999. So yeah, this question about how they behave and how they act, Rory, you're right to highlight, and the potential for them to be influenced by forces to their left, we shall see. I think it again will be indicative of how they're going to behave throughout the Parliament, whether they rush back into government. I think John Swinney probably won't be particularly keen on that proposal and would look to the Lib Dems instead. There's been a lot of laying the groundwork for that over the last couple of weeks. But I think the question for us is, are the Greens emerging as a hegemonic force on the left in Scotland, right? That's an interesting proposition, and I think it's worth talking about, right? Because there will be a membership surge, you would think, for the Scottish Greens following this result, and they have established themselves, as I've said, as a national party, demonstrating they can win in different places. The question for us is, how do we insert our politics into that space? Is it just people who we would expect to vote Green voting Green, or are they tapping into a broader mass of people across the country? That, I suppose, is the question for us. Rory.
I mean, you heard it here first, folks. It sounds like Coll McCail's joining the Greens as an insurgent member. No, I agree, and I take your disagreements well. I think to highlight those growing bases in Edinburgh and Glasgow is worth it for sure, especially in the context of Labour's declining vote. I think this raises broader questions, particularly ahead of the local elections next year, around the left outside of the sort of main centre left parties, as to where that goes, as to whether voters view that as a possible vehicle, or whether they'd rather just jump on board with something that's already got momentum like the Greens. It's certainly worth mentioning. Unless either of you two have anything else to add on the Greens, I think we should jump and take a brief look at the Tories and the Lib Dems as we're getting very, very close to the hour for a bumper episode. The Tories picking, well, a disastrous result, if you ask me. A loss of 19 seats, down 10% in both the constituency and in the region. In contrast, the Lib Dems picking up an increase of 11% on the constituency and 9% on the region, and causing some problems for the SNP as well. What did you guys make of these two? They're both sitting around 12 and 10 seats respectively. I suppose that makes the Lib Dems a large party for their records, but by contrast, I think that this is a humiliating result for the Tories, and a clear symbol that they are 12 for them is a minor party, right? What did you guys make of the results? I'll maybe come to Coll first.
Yeah, I don't think I have too much to say on this, and you're right, time-wise, we should probably move to wrap up. But I think the important point to highlight with the Tories is the disintegration of these blocs, which have characterised Scottish politics for the last 70 years. The Tories, historically, a very big party in Scotland, a weighty party in Scotland, a political force with a political infrastructure surrounding it, which has just been destroyed in recent years. So what happens there, whether Russell Finlay stays on, I think remains to be seen. But again, similarly with Scottish Labour, the people who you might have looked to take on his job aren't necessarily back in Parliament. So we shall have to see. Sam, have you got anything to say on the Lib Dems and the Tories?
No, yeah, just very quickly that, I think Tories, you could call them the biggest losers of this election, and Lib Dems performing surprisingly well. They always kind of come out of the woodwork in weird ways in elections these days. But just my only comment on the Tories is that I find it absolutely remarkable, like watching coverage from across the country, Scotland and UK, just how kind of irrelevant the news about them seems. It's like they lose, however, double-digit seats in Scotland. They lose hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of council seats in England. And it's just kind of like, it's very far down on the list of developments even, it's kind of just to be expected. That's an absolutely stunning kind of change in fortunes for a political brand that is, often cited as being one of the most successful in the history of world politics. So yeah, whether there's a way back is very hard to see from here.
On the Lib Dems, you never know. Maybe Alex Coll Hamilton telling the same story in every TV debate he went into about one encounter with a woman in the Highlands did swing him a couple of seats. But I think on that note, we will end it there. There are a whole lot of things to talk about regarding this election campaign and the result that we haven't done today. We'll be back with more election coverage throughout the course of next week. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to support Scotia financially on Patreon for as little as the price of a pint a month. As I said earlier, we have our WhatsApp channel and newsletter, which you can subscribe to at the link in the show notes. Rory and Sam, thanks for joining me. It's been an hour on a Saturday morning that I'm sure you would have rather have spent elsewhere, but thanks for coming on. Thanks to you for listening, and we'll be back next week. See you soon.